Hello, my name is Stuart. I am the unrepentant atheist, and today what I want to talk about is confirmation bias. So, first of all, I haven't made a video for a while because I've had one or two health issues to deal with, and it's nice to have a break now and again because it gives me a chance to watch various videos on YouTube, do some reading, and think about what I want to really talk about next. So, yeah, confirmation bias. Um, if you're wondering about the surroundings, I'm currently staying in a caravan, and I hope it's actually raining, and the noise of the raining is getting quite loud. I hope it's not coming across on the soundtrack, that you can hear me okay. So yeah, confirmation bias. Now there's a video. Somebody called into Atheist Experience about 7 years ago. His name's Scott. He's This video is the first on my playlist. If you go into my channel and look at my playlists, it's the very first one. And I like this call a lot because, apart from finding it very entertaining, very funny as well, it kind of epitomizes what I think is the confirmation bias, which is probably shoring up a lot of beliefs of theists, Christians in particular. And so we've got Scott. Yeah, he calls in, and the call sort of starts well enough, or well, relatively speaking. He's describing his own path and why he believes. And he starts off by saying that when he was young, he looked around him and he concluded that um, the apparent order that we've got in the universe and the intricacy of nature and uh, the whole process of nature, reproduction and death, and the whole wonder of it all led him to believe, or led him to conclude, that there must be an intelligence behind it. Somebody or something or somebody who loves people. So this was his conclusion as a young person, and he, whether he previously held a belief in God to that or not, he doesn't really say, but he concluded at a fairly young age that there was a God and that this God was responsible for everything that we see around us. And then he goes on. Well, Matt very quickly comes in and points out that perhaps this is not a good way to go about reaching conclusions, that we look around us and because something seems to be so, we conclude that it is so. And he asks Scott whether this is a good way to reach conclusions, to find out the truth behind the circumstances which brought us into existence. And he says, well, yes. And then he goes on to tell her, he then goes on to describe how, um, as he was maturing, he went to university and he went to a philosophy class. And he describes how he had a big, as he calls it, an aha moment, like a sort of eureka moment for him, which was triggered by uh, the professors of philosophy and all the students and people who were better qualified than him and more capable than Scott was to reach conclusions, all had different opinions. Now, this is something which, oddly enough, nobody's really picked up on, but because I've watched the video a few times and I've listened to what Scott was saying about that, it made me realize his aha moments was that he was never going to get answers from philosophy. That all these people, these professors of philosophy, all had different opinions, and they're much cleverer than he is, and yet nobody has got the absolute truth. There's only one truth. There can't be lots of them, and yet philosophy is delivering uh, too many different points of view, and he didn't find this comfortable. So he needed something more. He needed something that would give him certainty, because, as he said, he wasn't as clever as people who were smarter than him, who were unable, using philosophy, to reach solid conclusions. And he, of course, turned to his religious beliefs. He was at university. He describes how people were telling him about Jesus, how Jesus was the Son of God, etc., etc., died for our sins. Obviously, at university, um, I was at university in Britain, and there were Christian groups around. They weren't too bad, actually, but I did know some of those people, mainly evangelical type Christian groups. And I can imagine that in America it's even worse. So he had he had people coming at him with Christianity, and it's not enough just to believe in God, because he said he believed in God, but he hadn't taken that leap of faith to believe in Jesus. So he decided to test God to find. It's really weird, but he decided to test God, um, to ask whether there's any reality to Jesus and whether he should believe in Jesus. And his way of doing this was that he had an illness which he was apparently going along to a clinic for, but which they were unable to treat. And his deal with God was that he was going to pray that God could make him better from this illness. And if he did that, it would prove to him that everything about Jesus, which he'd heard from these Christians, was actually true. um, but just going back, so just backtracking on Scott and his worldview, and this whole thing about confirmation bias, that when he was young, he made up his mind that there was a God, and it was comfortable for him to believe in this God, and it appealed to him. And any investigation that he did from that point on was always going to be tainted by confirmation bias. Now, I don't really... Confirmation bias just means that you have a belief and that you go out looking for evidence to confirm it. Confirmation bias. So when you see some evidence, if it suits your bias, you will accept it. And if it doesn't, you will reject it. So with Scott, what he was doing was he was looking at, for example, the apparent order in the universe. Fine-tuning, for example. He referred to the rotation of the Earth, and that if it wasn't rotating at this precise speed, if it was rotating, for example, at, shall we say, I think he said 20 miles per hour instead of 950 miles per hour, something like that, we wouldn't exist, that we never would have come into existence. This, of course, goes back to the old fine-tuning argument. It's such a shallow way of looking at things, and it is evidence of his confirmation bias, because he's looking at what he thinks is perfect order in the universe, and there is no perfect order in the universe, whose function for him seems to be the existence of the human race, because, as Matt said in his conversation, that there's only this tiny little atom, as far as we know, in the whole universe where human life is possible, and under the sea, there are many places on the earth where human life isn't possible either, and that Scott is ignoring this contra evidence in order to confirm his own bias by looking after the fact at the reality we have now, and arguing that we've got this fine tuning and that it's the evidence of a benevolent, loving God. So it's the same thing with his prayer, that he prayed, and that, as he says in his story, that he received. He doesn't say what the gap is between the prayer and when he actually supposedly got better, but he got a phone call saying that his white count was normal. He still felt bad, but his white count was normal, and 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 this is a really weird thing. Although I suppose it's not 100% relevant. Um, so he got better, and it was only 6 months later that he remembered that he'd made this deal with God. I find that really strange, because if you'd prayed, if you'd prayed to get better, you had an illness, and a short time later you got better, surely you would remember that you had you had this deal with God, and that consequently you were going to believe in Jesus as a result. But in his case, there was a 6 month gap, which Matt found this. Matt was absolutely flabbergasted by this. And actually, it's the funniest part of the video. I really recommend that you watch it. It's absolutely hilarious. um, but so I've got. Let me just look at my notes here. Fine tuning. Oh yes, design. Yeah. So he he. I mean, earlier in the conversation, Matt said, "Well, what did you see about nature which led you to believe there's a God?" And Scott said, "Well, I observed butterflies. I observed how they live and how they die, and I observed the birds and the trees, etc., etc." And this is all, again, the confirmation bias. He's looking at nature, already believing in God, already believing in creation. So he's got this belief in creation. He's got this belief in a creating benevolent God. And then he looks at nature and he says, well, this God that I already believe exists obviously did this because he loves us. He created butterflies, he created nature. It's just confirmation bias. He's not looking at the scientific explanations. He's not looking at the theory of evolution and all the science that we've got, because it doesn't fit his bias. So he's just ignoring it. And it's not, we see this time and time again with Christians that phone in who think that they can prove God by shooting down evolution, when in reality all that's happened to them, in most cases, I suspect, they've had a so-called personal experience which makes them believe in God. Maybe they've read a passage in the Bible. Maybe they've read one of the Psalms and they've felt something. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. I mean, it's beautiful. And somebody who is already sympathetic to maybe that there is a God, reading that would think, oh my God, the Bible is really the book. And that simplistic way of thinking, with the bias you've already got inside, could actually strengthen your belief in a God, when actually you've got no good reason for believing at all. If you would take your thoughts a step further and really analyze properly and say, well, wait a minute, this is beautiful, it's uplifting, but does that mean that this book really has got proper sacred significance, and that it's the word of God, and that there really is a God? Or is it just that the person who wrote it was inspired, believing there's a God, without good reason, in the same way that Christian composers like Bach and Mozart composed beautiful masses which I really enjoy listening to, even though I'm an atheist. They've got belief in a God which doesn't exist, but they could still compose beautiful music because they feel inspired. And in the same way, in the Bible, there are beautiful things in the Bible. There are some ugly things as well, as we know, but there are beautiful passages in the Bible. Let's not deny it. But because they've got the bias, they're not taking that leap, not of faith. They're not taking a leap of a logic and reason to really question whether the cause of the beauty in that passage is actually behind it, is actually a real God behind it. So they're actually stopping in their thinking process because they don't want to go any further. Maybe they know that if they go further and really start breaking it down, the whole lot will collapse. And this is all a result of confirmation bias, which, um, I think I've said in another video that to an extent we've all got it. I mean, I've got it with certain art which I love, music which I love. With me, I suppose. I mentioned Mozart. I actually believe that Mozart's the greatest composer who ever existed, and I've got some, I think, justification for that. Other people will say it's Beethoven. They've got their justification, but I'm sometimes biased when I'm reading um, musicologists talking about the history of classical music, and maybe don't agree with me, and I'll kind of exclude it. So, I mean, I can fall into that trap myself in art, for example, my opinions about art. And but the big difference there is that, you know, whether Mozart was the greatest composer who ever existed or whether he wasn't really makes no great difference. And let's face it, art's subjective anyway. Um, but whether there's a God or not is a question which has got universal significance and which can impact my life. And it's a much more important question. And it's much more important, it's the most important thing of all, not to have confirmation bias when you're thinking about religion, because it has such a huge impact on your life. If you're going around with confirmation bias, you already believe that a God exists, and then you're going out to find evidence. You're counting the hits, but you're not counting the misses. If you're going out looking for evidence to back up your belief in God, it's a big deal believing in a God and worshipping a God. You've got to pray several times a day. You've got to go to church. You go around terrified that you'll end up in hell if you don't do good deeds. It really is a big deal. That's why I take the question so seriously, because if there is a God, and it could be proven to me that there's a God, then obviously it would have a huge impact on my life. It makes no odds whether, you know, Rembrandt is a greater artist than Da Vinci, or Mozart's a better composer than Beethoven. It's that's just a matter of opinion. But um, when it comes to religion and unproven claims, we've seen in the world so many horrible things happen in the name of religion, and they're all on unproven claims because people have got this confirmation bias. And I think that actually confirmation bias is the most common reason. It's the most common reason that theists are trying to shore up their beliefs by finding erroneous evidence. So that's Scott. I really do recommend you watch that video, because as Matt says, all Scott's doing is offering up fallacies and irrelevancies to back up his beliefs, and he's absolutely right. He ends up having to put the phone down on him because he puts a question to Scott, and he says, "How do you know? How do you know that your prayer to God was the cause of you getting better?" And Scott says, "Well, because the white count improved." And Matt quite rightly says, "Well, the white count improved, but how is that proof that there's a God and that he's got and that everything you've heard about Jesus is true?" And he just keeps going back in a circular. He comes back and says, "Well, because the white count changed. They told me." And Matt can't quite seem to get him to understand that he's got circular reasoning, and that he doesn't understand causation, correlation. Correlation does not equal causation. He doesn't necessarily doesn't doesn't um, doesn't equal causation. So he's got no grounds. He's got no grounds for believing that his prayer, because there are other possibilities, as he says, that illnesses can go into remission. You're not receiving treatment. People can just get better, and he's excluded that because of his confirmation bias. He already believes in God. He probably wants to believe in Jesus as well. He's got better. He said a prayer sometime later. He doesn't say how long. He simply got better. They're not treating him. And he's concluded that he got better because of the prayer. But he's got no way of connecting the two events. Absolutely no logical way at all. And Matt ends up having to put the phone down on him because he keeps going back to the same old thing, the same old silly, fallacious and circular reasoning. And it's all come about because of confirmation bias. And I'm sure that I've not said everything about confirmation bias that can be said. There's a lot more that can be said about it, and I've mentioned it before. But I just thought that Scott's telephone call was actually the best illustration of this which I've ever seen. And it's a call which lasts 20 minutes. But I would recommend you watching it. It is very amusing, I must admit. Um, but really, I'm recommending it to you because I think that it's quite a good textbook demonstration of every way in which you should avoid thinking, and in particular, the fact that Scott went from a philosophy class that was teaching him these critical skills in thought, and he rejected it because they were not providing him with the answers that he was seeking. He wants some kind of certain truth, and he felt he could only find that through religion. And the only way he could reach that conclusion is by improper thoughts, irrational thinking. And clearly, he learned absolutely nothing in that philosophy class, which is a real shame, because philosophy may not give you the answers, but at least it teaches you how to be a critical thinker. So, well, that's all I've got to say about confirmation bias. Hope you enjoyed it, and obviously leave comments if you want. And I'll see you again fairly soon.